What an honor it is to be here on day 3 of policy orientation with all of y'all and a very esteemed panel of policy experts. My name is James Quintero, and I lead the Foundation's Think Local Liberty project, which is the Foundation's initiative to advance conservatism locally in our cities, counties, and school districts. And by the way, if you haven't found us on Facebook yet, please do. Today we're going to be delving into the world of public pension reform and peeling back the onion of legislation that was passed during the last legislative session. I think it's fair to say that some of the most meaningful pension legislation was passed in the regular session of last year. And hopefully by the end of today, everyone in here will have a fairly good idea of what happened and why it's important. Now, this is a fairly meaty topic, so I want to do my best to be brief, introduce everybody, and really just jump right in. So let me introduce our panel today. We have 5 very excellent speakers who are lending us their time and their talent. Starting there at the far end is Leonard Gilroy, one of Reason Foundation's leading public pension expert, who regularly hopscotches the nation, lending a helping hand where he can. Sitting next to him is Chairman Dan Flynn, who led the charge on authoring both the Dallas pension reform as well as the Houston pension reform bill. Sitting to his right is Senator Royce West, who led the charge in helping to pass the Dallas pension reform bill. Sitting to Senator Royce's right is Bill King, former mayoral candidate down in Houston and one of the sharpest minds I know on public pension reform. I read all of his stuff all the time. And then one of my good friends, Max Patterson, who is both the executive director of TexPERS and one of my favorite people to joust with, at least for the near future. And so, gentlemen, thank you guys very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. So with that said, why don't we jump right in and let me ask a very open-ended question. What spurred the 85th Texas legislature to action, and are we better off for it? And Chairman Flynn, if we could start with you, sir, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the issue.
Well, the first thing I want to say is I didn't volunteer for the job. It was one that got handed to me. And what the concern that we had was the city of Houston and the city of Dallas, ERS, TRS were all in a situation where their actuarial soundness was questioned, and they had a tremendous amount of unfunded liabilities. The bonding companies were downgrading the bonds, and they told me that if they had to downgrade the bonds one more time in Dallas, they would start looking at the state of Texas bonds. And we enjoy the greatest bond rating you can have, and I think that that's what made the Texas legislature feel like we had to step in and do something.
Senator West, any thoughts?
I completely agree with Dan. When you begin to think about the city of Dallas, it had an unfunded pension liability totaling $7.6 billion, more than 5 times the size of its 2015 budget. And the Dallas Fund lost $196 million in 2014 bill based on some risky investments and things of that nature. And so something had to be done. There were governance issues. There was a run on the bank, so to speak. About $500 million was being taken out by the beneficiaries of the pension, and something had to be done. And under the leadership of my friend right here and working with the Senate, we were able to get something done. He's talked about Houston, and needless to say, we've always had this conversation about ERS and TRS in the state of Texas.
Bill, what do you think? What do you make of the last legislature and what they did on pensions?
Well, I think the 2 bills were 400 or 500 pages combined, so I'm not sure I can summarize it in too quick a fashion. But look, we've been approaching a crisis on these pensions for some time in sort of slow motion. The city of Dallas and the city of Houston got there before anybody else did, but frankly, the state of Texas is not too far behind. Right now, by their own accounting, the pension plans in the state are about $50 billion, $50–60 billion underfunded, and that's at totally unrealistic discount rates. Morgan Stanley came out with a report here a few months ago that said that at a 6% discount rate, which is what they thought should be applied, the unfunded liability for the state would be almost $100 billion. Now you go add $100 billion to our financial statement for the state of Texas and see what it looks like. You know, my fundamental belief has always been that we've got to get away from defined benefit plans and go to defined contribution plans. And I can tell you all the reasons why I think that's the only reform that will ultimately work. You know, we didn't do that in this session. We're not even talking about doing that in the legislature right now. And I think until we have that conversation, we're going to keep kicking this can down the road. Both of the Dallas plan and the Houston plan that I'm a lot more familiar with, both of them made significant changes to the plans and significant changes to the liabilities that taxpayers will have on those plans. There were some good things in Houston. At least we now have the right to vote on pension bonds. They lowered the interest rate assumption from 8.5 to 7.5, but we're still stuck with this broken model of defined benefit pension plans, and until we ultimately fix that problem, we're really not going to have a solution to this issue.
Max, what do you think?
You know, there's nothing wrong with defined benefit plans. You have to understand it. There's defined benefit plans around the country that work very well. You have to look at the components of it. You can have a defined benefit plan that's very poor and that won't give you very much money. It depends on the various components that you put in it. You can make a very rich defined benefit plan that's too rich, or you can have one that's too poor, or you can have one that's in the middle. It's the various components of it. And you got to look at that. You have to put it together to make it work for both the employer and the employee. The problem that you have in Dallas and Houston, it swung too far. And the problem is that the employer, the city, wasn't paying attention way back in many years. And there were some erroneous assumptions made. And the management of it wasn't done properly, and they got into trouble. You look at the state plans, and the state plans took many holidays. Years back, they didn't fund it. They said, oh, they don't need the money now, let's defer it, let's put it off to another year. And they just got way behind. And now they said, now we don't have the money, we can't afford it. That's not the right thing to do. And everybody want to focus on defined benefit plans. If you look at the amount of money that government throws out in enterprise funds or trying to lure corporations to come here, and they give tax abatements, and then it turns out that those tax abatements don't work. Nobody wants to jump on the bandwagon on that issue. I think you have to look at our workforce, and our workforce are people, and they're important. And Texas would not be where it is today without those people out there working. And you have to provide reasonable benefits for it. And DC is just not going to work. It's not going to get you here. And Texas is what it is today because of the pay, the benefits, and the kind of workforce that we have.
And actually, Max, I would agree with you. I think where we can find common ground is actually an agreement on the use of local economic development incentives, but of course that's for another panel. So, Leonard, I know that you may not have been following the Texas legislature intimately, as you're based out in Arizona, right?
Well, we watched it pretty closely because we watch pension reform across the country. So we watched, and I used to live in Houston for many years, so I watched that, you know, with a personal interest as well.
But you're a Dallas Cowboy fan, right?
I'm pretty sure.
I'm not even going to jump into that one. I'm a Cardinals fan, which is a pretty difficult spot to be today. But anyway.
So NFL aside, what do you think about what happened last session?
This was interesting, and it actually brought a lot back for us in terms of the experiences that we've had at Reason Foundation and our Pension Integrity Project at working with motivated policymakers across the country, state and local, to conceptualize, analyze, design, and ultimately try to execute pension reform. And bottom line is it's tricky. And as you guys have learned, as everyone on this stage has learned, you know, intimately over the last year or two, these are pretty big, thorny issues, especially then when you get into a collaborative stakeholder negotiation type process where you have labor, you have employers, you have business and taxpayer groups, you have everybody sort of in the mix and trying to come up with a, to sort of reach into the muck and grab for a handle, that can be very difficult work. And we experienced that when we, in my state of Arizona where I live, we worked and negotiated directly with we have one statewide public safety system that every police and fire, every first responder's in. And that was one that was in a free fall a couple of years ago, went from 100% funded, over 100% funded to 50% in the course of, less than 50 in the course of a decade. And we had to, and everyone looked at this situation, and the unions, I will give them tons of credit, they came to the table and said, guys, we're going to have some of our cities here that are going to go bankrupt because of the spiraling cost of this plan, and a lot of similar factors, lots of differences too, but it's what was going on. And that ended up being a year's worth of negotiation. I was there at the table doing the negotiation on behalf of our state Senate. Those were tough discussions and tough things to try to navigate, but ultimately, I think what both Houston and Dallas did was take a very productive first step towards dealing with some of the systemic issues that were sort of mentioned by previous speakers. Those are real issues. You had over $500 million that was just grabbed out of the account basically in Dallas through a faulty drop program, and that is just a bad policy design. It doesn't say that you can't do drop plans that work or don't work. And I would extend that out to the previous comment about defined benefit plans. There's nothing, and we're the first ones to say it. We say this all the time. There's nothing inherently wrong with a defined benefit plan. It's how you design it. And I would extend the exact same logic to a defined contribution plan as well. There are good DC plans and there are bad DC plans. And I think they should all be in the mix. And just as a cut to the chase, I think this debate that tends to happen in the policy world about should it be defined benefit or defined contribution creates this artificial either-or context that I don't think needs to be the way we think about this. And what we ended up coming up with in Arizona, for instance, and then my team has worked to do the same thing with the Michigan teacher plan last year and some other plans. Pennsylvania just rolled out a major reform that looks like this too, is offering choices. There are some people for whom a defined benefit plan is the right benefit. People are going to be around for 20, 25, 30 years who would basically make their way to the end of that period to receive the full benefit. Lots of folks do that. But if you look at the demographics in any pension plan, what you see is that you have what tends to happen is you have this pretty downward sloping curve. You have, of 100 people that walk into a system on day one, we see usually north of 50, 60% are gone out of that profession before they vest in the first 5 years. That means even though there are some people who that benefit would be great for in the long run, there are going to be those other people who would benefit from having a portable plan. And so rather than get into this artificial and frankly stale debate over should it be DB or DC, we say, look, you can offer both. You can build, and what we do is build new defined benefit plans from scratch that have better cost and risk sharing mechanisms. The Max had it right. You look at a place like Wisconsin or South Dakota, places like that have defined benefit plans that right from the very beginning built in self-correcting features and things like that that will keep those plans solvent in the long run. And that could mean benefits adjust over time, but the people walk into that system knowing that. It's a lot harder to come back and do that after the fact, which is why most pension reform is prospective. However, same thing on the DC side, and you can have good DC plans and bad DC plans, and if you look at the corporate 401k world, that's not a great world to emulate, and I would not recommend that for the public sector. What I would recommend for the public sector are DC plans that look more like what you see in higher ed across the country. Things like TIAA and Fidelity Nationwide offer these sorts of plans that are professionally managed defined contribution plans that are aimed at being a primary retirement vehicle to provide retirement security, not just a supplemental plan like a 401k was originally designed to do. So you guys, in Texas and in Houston and Dallas still have work to do. You guys did a lot. I think there's still some work to do in both cities on various aspects of the reforms. There's maybe assumption changes that need to happen. I agree, you cannot look forward today. There is no credible market forecast out there that says you're going to get 8+% on a 60-40 equity bond, traditional split. Nobody says that. Look at JP Morgan. If you go through the list of capital market forecasts, the future looks more bleak. All these systems in Texas need to be, I think, calibrating, recalibrating, and looking at benefit structures. And I'd be remiss if I didn't just say right now that we're happy and fortunate to be working with TPPF right now to do sort of a solvency analysis for this city, for the city of Austin. For those of you who don't know, you know, I think this is pretty fascinating stuff, but when you look at the city of Austin, there's $1.3 billion in unfunded liabilities just in the city's plan, in the employee retirement system here. That's a plan that was overfunded 20 years ago. It was 100 and something million overfunded 20 years ago. Now they're 1.2 in the red. And then, you know, if you look at what they think the markets are going to look like in the future, they think they have a 50% chance of hitting a 7.5% rate of return. We ran some Monte Carlo simulations around that using other capital market forecasts from JP Morgan and others, and we think they have less than a 20% chance of hitting 7.5%. And that same logic applies to Texas TRS, Texas ERS. You start going down the list, everybody's in this boat. So I think what Houston and Dallas and what the elected leaders have done here, along with stakeholders, is set a great marker down to say, guys, we've got solvency issues. Those were the most pressing that you had to deal with, and you did, and you've made some good steps. More to do, but great steps forward. But now you got to start looking at that across the board.
Great summation. Go ahead, Max.
You know, you sort of started to touch on this a little bit, and I've been fortunate enough, I spent over 40 years in my career in municipal government. And you really have to look at this from a macro standpoint. And I'm not a fiduciary on a pension board right now, but I have been. And so I can say this is, you can't just look at a pension fund. When a city sits down and plans its budget, it has multiple boxes it has to fill. And it's not just the pension, but it's the payroll, it's the health care, it's all the benefits that you have to pay the employee. You know, the pension board is only going to look at its pension board, at the pension fund, and they're going to say, well, we can't be concerned about the pay or the health costs. We're fiduciary just to the pension. But we really got to look at it all. We got to look at it all from a city standpoint. And until we reach that point and where the laws have got to be changed, because it's people who write all these laws. And you got these attorneys that come out and says, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. And I think some of these attorneys give bad advice, and I don't know where they're getting it from. They pull it from the sky or their interpretation of some regulation. And until you get somebody else higher up that changes their mind and reinterprets it somewhere else. And I said, sometimes I look at an attorney that says, okay, that's your interpretation. Now you can leave the room and I'm gonna do what I wanna do. But that's me, and I'm somewhat of a radical in that point of view. But you got to look at all of this. You got to look at pay, and you got to look at health care, and you got to look at the pension costs. And until you start doing this, we're going to have this problem, and it's going to keep coming back and keep coming back. My friend, Representative Flynn, he understands that, because when he looks at the state budget, he's got to look at it all. He can't just look at one. And my friend on the Senate side, he's got to look at the whole budget. He can't just look at one line item. And so until we reach that point, this debate is going to go on and on and on.
Please, gentlemen, just jump on in.
The problem is... You look at Dallas. We were in well, we still are, but we're working our way out of it. We had the pension issue. We also had a lawsuit in terms of pay referendum issue for law enforcement. And there has been some settlement of some of those lawsuits, but there's still a few out there that frankly could cost the city, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, we're not in billions anymore, we're hundreds of millions of dollars now in terms of getting those things resolved. And there are two of those suits that are teed up. So you're right, you can't look at it in isolation. You've got to look at the whole picture. You think about what we ended up having to do. I can tell you, when Dan's bill came over to the Senate, I just brought everybody in the room, okay? And we talked about not only the pension issues, but we talked about a whole host of issues, pay issues and everything else, until we were able to kind of bring everybody together and focus on the pension-related issues to get something done on that. But again, there's still a whole lot to do.
Kind of, I used the analogy, and a lot of people didn't like it, but it made sense to me. And what we were talking about is when you look at the numbers, they were so big, so great, and you couldn't just switch over to another program. It was being discussed on how we could do it, but the amount of unfunded liabilities were so great that we couldn't get there. So I said, you know, it's kind of like the old health care for Boy Scouts. You got to stop the bleeding, And you treat the wound, and then you heal the patient. And that's kind of what we try to do. It was a first step, and that was to stop the bleeding. That's what we feel like we were able to do. Now we're in the process of treating the wound, and we think we did that. Houston did the $1 billion pension review on. Dallas, they cut out COLAs. They did the things that were needed to do. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand is the whole template for retirement is so different now. In the TRS, we got 393 teachers over 100 years old. So you just think about that. It's going to be continued, that growth.
The actuaries probably did not account for that.
Yeah. and they tell me that if the good people of House District 2 allow me to come back, it'll be over 500 people. So 100 years old.
Wow.
The problem with defined benefit pensions plans, there's two problems.
And
one, we have no idea what they're going to cost in the future.
Yeah.
And we have defined benefit plans assume the hubris that we can predict interest rates, life expectancies, when people are going to retire, about 24 factors over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. And I'll give you a great example that came up in the 2015 legislature. We showed up, ERS had a big funding problem. We passed House Bill 9, which basically threw a bunch of money at the problem, and we all declared, or not all of us, but some of us declared, that problem had been solved and it was actuarially sound. It had an $8 billion unfunded liability at the time. And supposedly with the changes that were made, it went to a 30-year amortization. Report just came out on ERS in the last couple of months here. It now has an $11 billion unfunded liability, and the amortization period is infinite again. This is after we just fixed it, supposedly, less than 2 years ago. And the reason was that in the first year after the fix, ERS missed the investment target by 6 times the amount of money that the legislature put into it in 2015. Now, that's not because anybody was a bad person. It was just the hubris of thinking that we can predict the future even 2 years in advance. How silly it is that we can predict it 40 or 50 years in the past. Now, let me give you a good example. Let's assume that tomorrow morning we pick up the newspaper and MD Anderson down in Houston has cured cancer. Wonderful day for mankind. It's a terrible day for defined benefit pension plans because all of a sudden we've added this life expectancy that we did not anticipate. The other problem with these is because these things are so complicated, there is the moral hazard that it allows elected officials to promise one group, one constituency money without going to the taxpayers and getting the money to pay for it. I am not beating up on employees about their benefits. I promise you, I've got 3 of my relatives that are TRS beneficiaries getting TRS checks right now. They are very small checks, okay? It's not because we're paying our retired teachers multi-million dollars in retirements. It's because we haven't funded the promises, the benefit that we promised them in the legislature. Now, but that would have taken, according to the report TRS just issued, that would have taken another $35 billion to fund that plan. And by the way, that's still at a 7.75% discount assumption. Probably more like 50 or 60 billion. Where would we have gotten that money from? That's the problem with defined benefit pension plan. We can talk around this problem all we want to, and we can do things like say we're going to put, mechanism to change the benefits in the future. Well, if you're doing that, it's not a defined benefit pension plan anymore. The only way to do this is what the private sector did over the last 2 or 3 decades. They got out of these plans because they were too risky. And it's been done in governments all over the place too. Down in Houston, Metro changed from a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan. The Port of Houston did it. It's not a problem. It can be done. You just got to have the political will to do it.
Well, don't say that no one is, that the legislature is looking at that, because we did. We looked at it on a regular basis. But you still had the situation where you have
Stop
people.
the bleed.
Yeah, you got 30-year employees. All of a sudden, you're going to say we're going to change the rules. You can't do that. But your new employees.
Under the Houston plan, the payment.
I know you're not happy with what we did.
It goes up to the Houston payment over the next 20 years goes up to $1 billion a year.
And you supported that $1 billion pension bond.
So what are you saying? What are you saying? You're saying then that those persons that are currently in a defined benefit plan we need to convert those over to a defined contribution plan?
I think at a minimum, what we need to do is take new employees and put those into
Absolutely.
defined contribution.
I think that's
And
I think that's a
I don't think
conversation.
anybody
Great,
gets-
there
I
were
think
bills-
that's a
there was-
conversation that
there
we
was
could
a bill-
have.
There was a bill. There were bills in the
Well, I mean,
Senate
but
and
I-
the
but
House
again,
last time to
but-
do that,
but I mean,
and they
but-
didn't even get out of committee.
Okay, they didn't, okay? But they were bills that were filed. We had to make choices, we had priorities. Just as Flynn said, we had to stop the bleeding.
Look,
Based on the
look,
plans around.
if you recall, I had supported 21-9, but.
Can I finish?
Sure.
You sure? Okay, all right. We had to stop the bleeding in both Dallas, Houston, and I understand what you're talking about TRS and ERS. I really do.
Yes.
But so there needs to be a conversation, but you got to have everybody in the room when we have that conversation and put those figures out there. Verify those figures in terms of what, in fact, is the number right now in terms of our liability. And have people sitting at the table and have us make difficult choices. We had to make difficult choices in Houston and Dallas this time around. But we were able to bring together the people, make those difficult choices, and move on. And that's something that we're going to have to do next session.
Plus,
But
we had
there
to
was
change-
no
we had to
reason-
change the boards too. You
Oh,
know, you
yeah.
had boards that were sitting there doing their own personal benefits for themselves. which
You know,
is-
that was
might be
really a
with that.
Dallas problem, not a Houston
Well,
problem.
we're
but-
talking about both of them.
but-
And what I'm
But
saying
all I'm
is
saying
you've
is
got,
we could have added to both of those plans to put new employees in defined contribution. There was nothing inconsistent with that. Amendments were offered in the House and the Senate to do that, and they didn't get any
the
place.
first thing I learned when I went to the legislature, and that's good to clap, but I want to tell you something. If you don't have 76 votes, you can't do anything in the Texas House. If you don't have the number of votes that you need in the Senate, you can't do anything. What we were trying to do is get there, and but to say that we're not even considering other options that's inaccurate.
We had to stabilize
And-
everything.
Yeah, and I think we
We
did
had to
that.
stabilize- we
It's a
did.
good first
So
step,
let me- so
and
will
everybody's
both
going to
of
be looking
y'all-
at
will
it.
both of y'all support putting new employees in defined contribution plans?
Let me
at
tell you,
next session?
let me be real clear, because there's a camera right there. What I'm willing to support is this, making certain we have that discussion and bring everybody in the room and make certain that everybody has an opportunity to have input into the process and then figure out what we can come out with. That's what I'm willing to say.
Len, you look like you got something
yeah,
to
I'm
say.
going to jump in as the resident outsider, or former resident outsider. This is sort of the classic tension. Pension reform tends to happen in waves, right? And so there's no one shot, you're done. There's no one fix. Any legislator who thinks that's the way this works, please disabuse yourself of that notion. There's more work to do in Dallas, there's more work to do in Houston, and there's a ton of work to do on your state plans. You've got, right now, I'm going to correct Mr. King, actually it's not 11 billion underfunded, it's 22 billion underfunded today, and that's at a 7.5% discount rate, or I think 7.25. Again, we think there's about a 20% probability that they hit that. That number is really way more. You go up to the TRS plan, that's $32 billion underfunded right now, probably closer to 50 if you're more honest about the accounting. Those are real problems. And the way that you have to treat this, the metaphor that we always use is you have to treat this like an oil spill. And first thing you do in an oil spill is you got to cap the spill, right? You got to cap it. You just got to stop what's coming out from coming
bleeding.
out. Stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, and I would argue that Houston and Dallas took a big step at that. I think there's still more to do there. There's assumptions. If you look at any defined benefit plan, under the hood, there's all kinds of things going on. It's not just are you hitting your return. That's the one that everybody knows about. Underneath it, it's how about payroll growth? How about your salary growth assumptions? How about your mortality? This and that. You have to look at every single one of those. And once you do, and you start repricing this stuff using more honest discount rates, you're going to find that you've got, I'd say, $100 billion in unfunded liabilities just in the two state plans, probably just right off the bat. And that's not looking at all of the underfunded municipal plans. So you got a problem. Now, but that's not the only thing you do. After you cap the spill, then you have to go about the long slog of cleaning up what's spilled already, and that is the billions and billions of unfunded liabilities across these systems. And that's difficult work, and it takes money. You're not going to be cutting those benefits for things that have already been accrued because, even if you didn't have to confront the moral aspect of that, you'd have to confront the courts, and the courts say no. The courts say these are contractually guaranteed benefits. Right. You're going to pay it. So basically, the way that we view this is, right now, treat this like a sinking ship. All of these plans, treat them like a sinking ship. Stop new people from coming into them tomorrow. Now, that can look different. It can look like what Mr. King says. It can look like what others say. I would say throw some choices in there. Throw a defined benefit plan that auto-corrects because then you kind of take that, and create that option for those people that want that, but then create a good DC option, and then you've got choices. When we did this in Arizona, when we were talking with the public safety folks there, I remember bringing up, what do you guys think about a DC plan? I mean, you could imagine, you guys know what that reaction would look like. Until after that meeting, and some come up and say, there are parts of that we do like, though. We got some chiefs, for instance, who are vested somewhere else. They don't want to sit in another plan and revest in a new pension. How about a DC plan for that? And that started to create a dialogue in which we found win-win scenarios here. And then on the other side, it was, how about a defined benefit plan, but a new defined benefit plan that has full equal cost sharing between employers and employees, even on unfunded liabilities. So if you want that guaranteed paycheck at the end of retirement, you have to be willing to take some risk, right? It's not, you don't have a choice between a no-risk option and a risky option. There's risk either way. It's just, what do you want? Do you want the ability to invest your own money and sort of take your path forward and how chart your own retirement, or do you want a guaranteed benefit, but with the risk that you might have more taken out of your paycheck to cover it if what has happened in these other plans happens, moving forward, which is, we were wrong about the future. And anytime you're trying to gamble on what's happening 30, 40, 50, really in a defined benefit plan, you're talking 80 to 100 years from now when you look at survivor benefits and that sort of thing. So any change you make today is going to take at least a half a century to fully play out.
And part of that is you can't continue to pay automatic COLAs at well above market rate,
right.
Which is one of the things we had to stop. Yep. And it's all a part of working through it, and without completely disrupting someone that has been working for 30 years. Our plan was pretty simple, I thought. We had to have an actuarial sound plan. We wanted to be sure that the retired people that have retired continue to have their retirement not as favorable as they initially thought it was. It created a lot of problems, a few threats. But anyway, not only that, but then you had to go back and say, well, we've got new people coming in, so we're going to have a plan for them, which is what we want to consider without question, Mr. King. And then you've got the existing people that are there, and try to convince them.
That's not what 2190. 2190 took benefits away from retired employees in Houston. We had, listen, this is something I've said from the beginning. Look, and we've got some firefighter people. They will tell you I've been as hard on them as anybody in the city of Houston, saying these plans are not realistic, they're not sustainable, we've got to change them. But I've always said we change it going forward. We don't go back and change it retroactively. And what 2190 did is it took away COLA benefits from people who had been retired for years that they were counting on. That's a change in benefits. We reduced their benefits. Overall, the firefighters' benefit was reduced about $100,000 per employee over their objection. Now, the police and the municipal people negotiated a reduction in benefits in exchange for getting bond money. If they want to do that, that's fine with me. But the firefighters got their benefits cut over their objection without getting any bond money by about $100,000. Now, folks, that's nothing but reneging on a promise that we've made. And let me just tell you what, if the conservative community, if the business community is not going to stand for the sanctity of contract and living up to what we said we were going to do, then who the hell is going to in this society? And we as a state and we as a city did that to the firefighters. Look, that plan had to be changed, but we absolutely dropped their benefits, we dropped earned benefits.
Don't filibuster. Let me ask you, do you know that many of those firefighters were getting over 200% of what their previous salary was? And that's why we had to do some of these things. You can't just let something continue to run, and that's why we had to make changes.
I've been the one talking about that the benefits are unreasonable. But once somebody gives us their 30 years of service, we made a deal with them. They accepted a salary and benefits and gave us that time. We can't give them the time back. You can't go back and change the deal retroactively.
Let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you what happened in Dallas. I mean, one of the biggest issues we had in Dallas was governance. Okay, and that was the issue. And frankly, the sides came together, and we were able to work out a deal concerning governance, giving the city the majority on the board, but making certain that key decisions that needed to be made about the plan required a 2/3 vote, which basically meant that those persons representing fire and the police had to make certain that they were on board when key decisions were being made concerning the plan. And so, you know, again, we've stabilized. There's still a lot of work to be done, but the reality is that going forward and making tough decisions about defined benefits, defined contributions concerning the plan, changes to the plan, would require a 2/3 vote.
And putting people on the board that had some abilities.
It had the expertise. It had the expertise.
Yeah, that was really a Dallas problem, not a Houston
real
problem.
fast.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these references that are made is just don't like DB plants at all, you want to go to DC. And there's references made to the private sector. Keep in mind that in the private sector, where they've gone to only DC only, you don't have to worry about any promises. Because in a DC plan, all the risk is shifted to the employee. The employer takes no risk. And in terms of how much they contribute to you each year, can vary. If the employer profits are low, then they're going to give you less, because there is no promise. You know, if they have big profits, maybe they'll give you more, but if their profits are low, then they can give you less, because they promise you nothing. And the unfortunate thing about it, you look at how bad Social Security is now, at the end of 30 or 40 years, or 50 years down the road, when you retire from that private sector company, what are you going to turn to? Social Security? Your DC plan, where you made those investments in the market, and unfortunately, that year you decide to retire is a bad year in the stock market, and you've lost all that money, what are you going to fall back on? And so what are you going to say? Well, you know, I'm just as bad as the other guy, or just because the other guys don't have any or got more money, he should be just as bad as me? I mean, that's what this is all about? No. I mean, no, what we need to do is we need to fix it on both sides. It needs to be fixed on both sides.
Max, what kind of plan do you provide for your TechSpurs employees?
We have they have a
401k.
We have a 401k that we contribute to, that we have a guaranteed floor into it.
Nobody spending.
But
their
I
own
only
money
have 5 employees.
Yeah.
So don't try and make that match.
Nobody spending
Bill,
their own money
there's
has
nothing I
defined
can say that
benefit
would
pension
will
plans.
cause you to change or even look at a DB plan. Your mind is made up. Your mind is made up.
Bill,
You're not going to change.
Is your mind made up?
Mine's made up on this. Yes, sir.
I'd like to convince both of you
Max,
guys.
Max and I agree on that.
I'd like to get both of you guys together in a room to figure out how you could get more comfortable with DC and you could get more comfortable with a better DB, because I think that's the future. And you're absolutely right. Just, you know, the private sector needs to up their game too.
Oh, I can. I can compromise with a little of both.
Well, so if you
Can
look
you
out there.
convince Bill to compromise with a little both?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to talk to him separately. But I'm happy to have those conversations because I think it's important. And when you look out there, some of the innovation that's happening in the DC side of things is pretty interesting today. If you look out there, you know, I'm not going to bring out any particular funds or vendors. I don't want to get into that. But there's an emerging wave of investment options within DC plans that basically, long story short, try to replicate what's happening within a defined benefit plan. With the exception of you're not guaranteeing that payout at the end, but what you're trying to do is target a specific replacement income in retirement, which is usually, you know, ballpark about 80%. That's sort of the sweet spot that most, you know, employers, financial advisors are looking for in retirement, is about 80% of your pre-retirement income. And some of that, for those that are in Social Security, can be made up, you know, that's about 30% or so of that. And then the other bit would be made up by a DC plan that, you know, could have essentially, like a target date fund that rebalances over time, actually de-risks the plan and buys like annuities or treasury and inflation-protected treasuries, that sort of thing, to basically replicate what a defined benefit does in a DC context. Those are the kinds of things that more employers need to be offering.
Let me answer this, and I'm a novice at this. If we have a defined contribution plan, and as Max was talking about, the year that you decide to retire, the bottom falls out of the market. What happens to that individual that's in the defined contribution plan?
It depends.
Most of them don't have Social Security either.
Well, it depends. It depends on what their investment mix is, and if you have.
Hold on. Let me be real clear about what I said. What I said is that the bottom fell out of the market. The plan isn't worth realistically, let's just say maybe 50% of what it was before the bottom fell out. And this person is retired, but there's still probably about 20, 25 years of life expectancy. What happens to that person?
Well, again, I'm saying that it would depend on what they're investing in. If their investment options were along the lines of what I described, along the entire way.
No, see, again, you're not answering my question. The question was a real simple question. If, regardless of what the investment mix is, I'm saying that the bottom fell out, and and whatever their portfolio was, it's worth 50% now, and they have 20, 25 years to live, and it's a defined contribution plan. What happens to that person?
Well,
It'll be very tough.
it's going to be tough, and they're going to have to keep working.
Okay, they're going to have to keep working. All right, so is Bill, let me ask this. Is that a scenario that we should be putting our fellow man in?
That's not a fair question, though, because
It's a very fair question. It's a real question.
What I'm
It's a real
describing is
question.
like plans that
I'm
are in
happy to answer the
existence
question.
today, not like, let's take the worst case scenario of a
Well, I
DC
think
plan.
from a policymaker's standpoint, I've got to take into consideration all different types of scenarios.
Well,
okay?
right, but then what I'm saying is if you're going to offer a DC plan, don't just offer a free-for-all DC plan. You offer a DC plan that is professionally managed, has guardrails, has an annuity purchase options either at the end or along the way through deferred annuities, and basically you build a world-class DC plan that is designed to not get you there.
I'd all due respect, and I mean, I don't know the history, and maybe y'all can tell me the history of this. When we started doing defined benefits plans, we said that this particular defined benefit plan, when we started this was the best plan available and would do all the things that we're talking about now that defined contribution plans can do. But we find ourselves in a situation, not only in Texas, but nationally, having a bunch of unfunded mandates, unfunded plans that are insolvent.
Of course, we had a you know, your markets went south. They were still trying to pay out what they said they were going to do, and you could make 1%. You couldn't make 0.5% on what they did, but they were still paying out at that 8.5% level, unsustainable. And then you're sitting there looking at that, and then people are living longer. It was a scenario designed to fail, and that's what's happened. And so now we've got to redo the template because people live longer. You're going to have to take into consideration that you're going to have some investments that you're going to have to be a little bit more conservative with. You can't go lose $1 billion in Hawaii on a land deal. You can't lose $1 billion in Paris, France on $1 billion. You know, I mean, those are the kind of. So you got to have a board that has financial knowledge to be able to make those decisions. And I think that's what's happened. We had two major plans, and I'm not forgetting ERS and TRS because those are certainly on the table. But there has to be a new template. And I think for the first time, maybe, everybody, even in the legislature, the private sector, and in the public sector, they're not going to be able to continue what they once thought they could have. Whereas the Houston firemen, they were going to make 200% of what their actual salary is while they're working. You can't do that.
But I would just say, Max also pointed out that you guys have a DC plan internally that has, you said it had a floor, right? So it's got probably a no net loss sort of provision or something like that. And that I mean, you have to pay for that. That's part of, probably a more costly plan than one that would be totally at risk. But again, to answer your question, don't provide a DC plan that doesn't have that. I mean, these are design features just for the same reason that defined benefit plans have gone south in this state and all across the country. Put a dollar figure on it, it's between $1 to $6 trillion unfunded, depending on whose math you believe about the future. Either way, if you take the plans at their own word, it's $1 trillion underfunded. That's real money. That's because of faulty design, right? And if you look at the DC side, the reason that you have really bad savings for a lot of people in corporate 401k plans is bad design. Because they didn't require employers to contribute, for instance, that sort of thing. When we do DC plans, I'll just tell you the one we did in Arizona for public safety, that now, as of July last year, every police and fire new hire that walks into an employer today in Arizona has a choice between a risk-modified defined benefit plan. It's the same multiplier as the old plan. It looks the same on the hood, but underneath it's 50-50 cost sharing. There's the triggers on COLAs, so if the markets go south, you're not paying out benefits while you're losing solvency, that sort of thing. Or they could choose a defined contribution plan that's a professionally managed plan I think Nationwide got that. And it's a 9% required minimum employer match, minimum 9% employee. So that's an 18% DC right there, which is anybody in this crowd who has a DC plan knows that's a great DC plan.
And that's exactly what we wanted to do. We had to stop where we were and then look at these good plans. And there are a lot of, like you said, there's a tremendous amount of good plans out there that we can consider.
Let me answer your question you put to me. Okay. There are two fundamental risks in retirement. It's the rate of return and the actuarial risk. You know, I'm not going to run out of money before I die. That's the risk, and that depends on how much my assets are earning and how long I'm going to live. Now, your question was, what if the market drops out the year that you retire? Well, presumably in a 401k, you wouldn't be going and liquidating it, so the market will come back, and over time, that tends to be the case. We see what's happened in the market just over the last 8 or 9 years here. But the truth of the matter is, if you have some catastrophic loss like that, the DB plans are going to have the same loss. And so the question ends up being, is this a risk that the employee ought to have, or is it a risk the taxpayer ought to have? That's really the decision that you're making here. And the private sector employers have said, we're not going to take that risk anymore. Maybe there's something a little bit different about the public sector. I'm not totally convinced about that. But I will tell you the one model that's a hybrid that has worked fairly well through this, and that's the cash balance plans, which is the county plan and the Texas municipal plan. Both of those have worked kind of okay, but there's some real discipline in those about how much, you know, in those situations, those plans tell the counties and the cities how much money they have to put in. And if they don't, then they get thrown out of the plans. And so, you know, that is something that keeps some of the features of a defined benefit plan. I don't know if y'all are familiar with cash balance plans. You basically accumulate money like a 401k, but at the end of the time, you annuitize whatever the balance is for the remainder of the employee's life, and they can pick, they can have survivor benefits or not have survivor benefits. That is a sort of middle road approach, and if you look at the history of those two systems, they're a whole lot better than either municipal plans or any of the state plans. From my standpoint, I think we ought to go straight. I think everybody ought to be in Social Security. I think everybody ought to be in 401ks, and that's the way it ought to go. But if you think the public sector needs to be different, that would be the place I would look for as a model.
You put all these things on the table. I mean, you've got to put them on the table. You're right. There is a $1 trillion problem out there in this country. And obviously, we can't continue to kick the can down the road, but we've got to have everyone in the room that is a stakeholder in order to come up, number one, agree on what the facts are. That was one of the problems with Dallas. We couldn't agree on getting an analysis of what the problem was. But get people in the room, figure out what we can agree upon, and then kind of work from there.
And you know, there's almost 400 pension plans in Texas, $66 billion in unfunded liabilities. 20 of that was in Houston, 20 of that was in Dallas. So obviously, there are a lot of good pension plans that we oversee that are very successful. Mr. King mentioned a couple that are out there, the county plan. But they have more discipline. They've looked at it a different approach, and that's what we have to do for all pensions. It has to be a new template. You cannot continue what had been done.
1 second. Chairman, I do want to draw out some of the features that I think are kind of being alluded to here in the self-correcting mechanism and the cash balance plan, because SB 2190, which was the big Houston pension reform bill, did include some innovative new elements like a corridor mechanism and the cash balance trigger. Can you explain to the audience what those were?
Probably not in 5 seconds. As I told you earlier, don't get us in the weeds because I don't think we'll keep the audience. But you know, it was a series of having to go through, look at every part of it. And the interesting thing is that the members of the legislature in Houston and in Dallas, they all passed. The people that were involved with us, the pension bills, they signed off on it. They signed off on it. And so everybody knew this was a step one. It wasn't something that was going to solve the problems. And that's what we had to do. As we said earlier, you have to stop where you are and look at a new template, and we're all doing that. Everybody that's involved in pensions you know, they're really studying it, because I don't want to come back the next session, assuming I get to come back, and be where we were. I'm not going to do that.
Can you answer his question, please? Can you answer Royce's question?
Well, let's, with respect, why don't, Max, I want to go to you because I want to hear, did TexPERS offer any thoughts on either the corridor or the cash balance trigger? Is that something that TexPERS was supportive of? And can that potentially be extended to other plans?
No, because that affected our members, and there was a difference of opinion among our members on the specifics of the plan. Therefore, we remained neutral, and we did not get into offering an opinion on those.
Okay. Lynn, come on in.
You know, one of the things that, these are complicated systems, right? And, you know, it took a long time for them to get to the solvency problems that they've been having. It takes a long time to unwind. And the thing that a lot of people don't quite realize when they walk into this kind of discussion is that there's a lot of different things you need to really focus on. And I'd say there's probably, you know, 4 big buckets. You need to be looking at your funding policy. Just, are we making, you know, how are we amortizing, you know, that sort of thing. I would say the era of 30-year amortizations is long gone. I know that Houston they made a big first step, which was closing an open amortization period, which for those of you who don't understand all this, that basically, it would be like refinancing your mortgage every single year forever, meaning you never pay it off. It will always be there. So Houston made a big first step in closing that, but they put a 30-year window around it, which creates a lot of decades of opportunity for problems. So I would say, you know, best practice these days is 20 years or less. That's a big thing. That's one bucket. There's another bucket, which is assumptions, and looking at not only the rate of return, but the other kinds of assumptions that actually price these systems ultimately. That's how they're priced. You also have to look at plan design, and that's where the DB, DC kind of debates, cash balance, all those sorts of things come into play. You've got plan design, and what do we build not only for solvency for the future to make sure that we don't have this problem creep up again, but also we have to, this is an HR thing, right? This is, you have to be a competitive employer. You know, you can't just slash benefits to the bone and expect people to want to work there. So you have to really balance out the sort of fiscal side of this with also what do we want to offer people and what's a good, just, you know, competitive retirement benefit. So there's that. And the final bucket that's really important and that came to head in Dallas was governance. And you've had some major governance issues here, and still you do, because the legislature, you know, a lot of cities can't make changes to their own pension systems because they have to come to Austin and go to the Capitol to get you guys to do it. That's crazy. You can't let that continue. You've got to, to the legislature, I'd say to every legislator in this room or that's listening, stop that, let go, release that, let them do it, because it's their decisions, it's their system. It's not a state system. And that's just a recipe for failure, because it means that when there are solvency problems in the future, you don't have to go through all the hoops and hurdles in the legislature. You can deal with that at a homegrown level, which is a lot more efficient and will spare some pain down the road.
Bill, what about that?
I think in Houston and Dallas, they know that the state of Texas is not going to produce $1 billion to shore up their bad mistakes.
This is let me just talk about this 30-year amortization for a second. This is the kind of crap you get in defined benefit pension, okay? If you would think of 30-year amortization, you would think, well, I'm going to go out and get my mortgage table, and I'm going to figure out how much it is for a level payment over 30 years. That's not how they do it in the pension world. In the pension world, and this is, by the way, written into the state law in 2190, it says that they're going to use a level payroll method to amortize it off. And the way that works is they go out and they project what the payroll of the city of Houston is going to be over the next 30 years. Well, first of all, that's bullshit. Nobody knows what the payroll for the next 30 years. Then they take what level percentage of that number over the next 30 years does it take to pay it off? Well, what that results in is a negative amortization for about the first 5 or 6 years. In other words, the length of time that anybody at the city of Houston is still going to be in office. And then the payments go up astronomically, end up hitting over $1 billion a year out in about year 21 or 22. This is a joke. We're not going to pay it off in 30 years because we're not paying a real amortization payment. This is the complexity that you have in defined benefit pension plans that the average person is never going to understand, and why I think we need to get rid of them completely.
Max, go ahead.
A pension plan is extremely complex. And it's crazy if you sit out there and think the average person is going to ever understand it. And it is not designed for the average person to understand it. It's not even designed for you to understand it. It is extremely complex. And the other thing is, you got to understand, this is a city. The city it's not expected that the city is going to go out of business. It's not designed for the city of Houston or the city of Dallas to go out of business. It will always exist as long as those people are there, and there will always be policemen, and there always will be firemen, and there always will be city employees, and the pension plan will always continue on infinitely. And they talk about this 30 years. Keep in mind that those 30-year numbers will be recalculated every 30 years. Those numbers will change every year. The unfunded, that number will change every, matter of fact, that number changes every day. And when they talk about what the market is, one day out of the year, an actuary will take whatever that number is, that one day out of the year, and run all their calculations, and they'll do that one day, once a year. All these numbers change constantly, and these are paper numbers. These are numbers on paper. And this is not something that will ever expected to be paid off at any one time. These are constantly moving paper numbers. And and people will grab these numbers and try and make a big deal out of this. And it's not like that.
But the thing is, and I totally agree with you, you're right, it's always a moving target, and things change, and conditions change, and every day you could recalculate, redo the actuarial reports, and get something different. But there is something that is constant, and that is the promise that you've made. Now, I can't tell you exactly what that number is, because it's subject to a lot of assumptions, but for the people earning that benefit, it is a real number that doesn't move, and that is the benefit that they are, that they were offered and took in good faith.
That's correct.
Upon entering the workforce. So I think we agree on that point, but what I would say is that doesn't mean take your eye off the ball as the numbers change. What it means is, that means it's more important, I would say, to be conservative, to use conservative assumptions, to be willing to price it right. That's the thing. Like, here's what nobody really took into account back when creating these systems, because back then the markets were different, interest rates were different. It all looked like it was going to work, and did for many years, until we have a different reality, and we have ultra low interest rates now that have forced these pension funds that has helped contribute to this problem. I think when you go back and look at this, you have to. We think it's important to. Bill's absolutely right. 30-year amortization is crazy. When we build new defined benefit plans like we did in Arizona, that one we put a 10-year layered sort of amortization thing on. We wanted it even shorter, but through the politics of it, had to land at 10. I'd love to see it every single year. You have an unfunded liability, you've got to pay that off, right? That is the way these should be run. So there's a lot of design mechanisms and assumptions and all that have to change around it to keep these plans solvent. But at the end of the day, there is a number, and it's what's been promised. And so if you're, and I would just say this, I would just close on this. If you're going to do a defined benefit plan well, you can do it. But what it means is price it very conservatively, because I'd rather be wrong, I'd rather be wrong to the upside than wrong the way this has been going, and be willing to fund it. Be willing to properly fund it and fully fund it. Don't do level percent of payroll amortization where you're basically banking on rising payroll down the road, which turns out to be a fantasy, and if that number's wrong, the whole thing falls apart. That's just one assumption that can blow this apart, and there are many. And then you have to be willing to pay for it, and just understand that it is costly. It is costly to provide someone a benefit in retirement and to guarantee that they are going to get a payment through retirement. We know that through Social Security. We know that through pension plans. So just be willing to pay the price. If that's what you want to offer.
Hang on, gentlemen. Let
me say this. And this is a great session. Based on my experiences, we've got to make certain that we understand what the problem is, agree what the problem is, make certain that we appreciate what the purpose of the plans are, and make certain the persons in the room that need to have input into that process are there. Make certain we have some of the best and brightest minds, be it public, be it on the contribution. I wasn't talking about you, Bill.
I was feeling all good there for a second, Royce.
I mean, but have different perspectives in there on contribution and benefit plans, and then go at it. And we need to stay in a room and get it done. I agree wholeheartedly as a conservative, moderate conservative Democrat, all right, that we've got to do something about this issue, because otherwise it's going to be layered on the back of our children in the future. And the other piece is this. A lot of the public employees that are in this plan, this is part of the incentive, having a good pension plan is part of the incentive in the first place for them to go to work for the government to do a public purpose, because they don't get Social Security. And so we've got to keep that in mind as we deal with this problem in Texas during the next legislative
So we're starting to run out of time. Gentlemen, hang on one second.
Getting Social Security, some don't.
I don't know what it says about me, but I could listen to this stuff all day. But let me bring the audience in now. I know we have a roving mic, maybe a question or two. Usually we find some. Yes, sir. And briefly, for the sake of time, we have about 10 minutes, so if you can keep your question short and to the point, appreciate it.
Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Gilroy, the statement was made, I can't remember who made it, said that the state of Texas is right behind the city of Dallas and the city of Houston. What would you advise the state of Texas to do going forward?
Do you mean, just to clarify, do you mean with the state plans, not the local? Yeah. So with the state plans, you've got some massive problems that look like every other state. And let me tell you what your legislators are going to run into. They're going to run into it and see something like, if I remember correctly, sorry, I've got the numbers right here. I'll pull it up. Your Texas teacher plan, for instance, that plan right now is about 80% funded. Okay? Now that's under faulty math. It's really not that. That's not the reality. However, that's what they report. It's 82% funded. But it's got $32 billion in debt, but people are going to look at that and go, oh, I always heard that if a pension plan is 80% or greater funded, then we're okay. Stuff like that, you first have to start squishing, because what I will tell you is if you don't have a pension fund that is right now at the top of a market, sitting at 100% funded, you've got a problem, right? What the pension plans are not like Social Security. They are pre-funded. They're not Ponzi schemes. They're not meant to work like that. They are meant to be 100% funded and sort of hover up and down, above and below that as market and business cycle happens. And you want the upside to capture to sort of make up for the downside and have that thing hum along at 100% funded. None of your plans are doing that. So that's a signal. You got to do something here. And I would argue that it's in the employee's best interest to be engaged on this. If I'm a teacher, I'm sort of picking on that plan, but it's just one. It's the one with the biggest liabilities, unfunded liabilities right now. If I'm a teacher looking at this, we just went through a reform effort in Michigan last year and got it done with a plan that was $32 billion, almost exactly to the number, underfunded. Slightly less in terms of funded ratio, but the bottom line is it is going to be better for the teaching profession that this problem gets solved, because I don't remember the percent of payroll out of that system that's going to pay off debt. But I can guarantee you it's north of 5, 6, 7, 8%. It's going to be probably way more than that. And what that means is those are dollars right now that are being siphoned off to go pay for a department of the past that doesn't exist anymore, when it should be basically there to create the opportunities for, you guys can have the scrum over what happens with that freed up money, but that's where pay increases are going. So if teachers are asking the legislature for pay increases, it's there. That's where it is. It's going off to pay unfunded liabilities to pay for people in retirement and healthcare and those sorts of things. And so you really need to be going in and looking at these systems, and again, looking at plan design for new people. People who are there now, block them in. New people need something different, but that's still a good benefit. You need to look at your assumptions and ratchet those down. You need to look at your funding policy and making sure you don't have these wacky long level percent of payroll amortization schemes, and then finally governance, is going to be really important. And when we did I keep coming back to this, but we did the public safety reform in Arizona. Part of that reform was, because we were asking the new cops and firefighters who were going to be taking a defined benefit plan that had full cost and risk sharing, 50-50. It was only fair for them to have 50-50 representation on the board, and so we had to reconstitute the entire board to make sure that the risk profile in the plan sort of mirrored what was, the board composition. Things like that are pretty complicated, and you have to really dig in. So I would say anybody, for these gentlemen up here who have this as their, one of their priorities legislatively, you got to look at these systems, do it with an open mind, be open to a lot of data, and start asking for sensitivity analysis, because the plans are not themselves naturally going to give you the total picture of what's really happening out here. So
good stuff, Len. Let me go to our next questioner.
So I've heard a lot of painting with broad brushes. So I wrote down my questions so I wouldn't go on too long. So you don't do brain surgery with a shovel. It requires a lot more delicate instruments. you also have to do it on the right patient. So how do you fix the plans that need fixing without ruining the plans that have far fewer problems? And how do you keep from breaking the promises you've made to employees who've taken sub-average wages in return for a pension that they've been promised, not for one that somebody else thinks they should have?
I'll jump in.
Well,
Put a firewall.
Let me get our legislators in.
Yeah, in terms of, let me take several of the questions and help me if I don't answer. As it relates to promises made, I think we have to keep those promises unless there is a public emergency. We have to keep those promises. And even if there's an emergency, then we scale back as little as possible on those promises. As going forward, we need to put everything on the table for consideration, understand what the issues, specific issues are, and then deal with surgical precision with as many of those issues as possible. I can tell you that there may be 10 surgical issues that we need to deal with during the legislative process, and if we get 4 or 5 of them right, then we get those right and move on down the road and then come back and try to get the others right.
You know what, it's a unique situation, and first of all, you had a board that wasn't always showing up for board meetings, so you had the people that were there to give personal enhancement. Well, some people think that's illegal, and then the others that wouldn't even come to a board meeting because they were bullied. Well, you have a fiduciary responsibility, and you don't get to reduce that just because you didn't go. And so that was one of the things. I think one of the most important things that we did was create a board that can be looking at every day looking at it. And we didn't want any elected officials on there, so they weren't having to answer to an election all the time. And we wanted successful CFOs to go in there and analyze it on a regular basis. And so what we've tried to do is work that new template out and look at the options that are going to be available. And I think that it was the first step. There are many more steps to go, but the thing is you do have an obligation. And then you can stay in the courts for 30 years if you don't take care of that obligation.
And let me add this, in terms of the governance issue, like in Dallas, you had to get as much of the politics out as possible. As an example, and who was responsible at City Hall in terms of the appointees on the board? Well, there were council persons that wanted to have input into that process and be able to appoint their person, so to speak. And so the way we resolved that, we gave the mayor the ability to do the appointment, but he had to, just like any appointment the governor makes, he had to confer with the council on the appointments. So it worked itself out.
Why don't we move on to our, yes sir, how are you?
Great, how are you? So it's a math question, and I haven't heard anybody say anything about the drop accounts. Can you tell me what a senior or an assistant chief in the Houston Police Department making $198,000 a year has in his drop account if he was eligible to go in there in 1995?
Bill, Max, you guys want to take a shot at that?
I don't think you can. Get the calculator out here.
Don,
and
the only
computer
number,
maybe.
the only published number I've ever seen was on the firefighters. Was the year before last, and it was like about 900,000 was the average drop account. Obviously, that takes in a whole variety of people that have different salaries, and the guys that would be up at the higher level would be significantly more than that. But that's what the drop account published number was. 900,000.
Individual.
Right. That was the average drop account as of last year in the Houston fire plan. Now the police plan is a little bit different, but they're pretty similar. But that was the average.
And I would think it's much lower than that in the Dallas plan that we looked at. It wasn't that high. Now a lot of them came in on the tail end, and that's why we had to run on the bank. Those that had the big numbers, they ran and got it. And that created another problem for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of those drop accounts were fixed with the last legislative bill that they modified or did away with those accounts. I know they did away with them for new people coming in, and they tried to correct.
The big issue was whether we could claw back.
Yeah.
We probably have time for 2 more questions. Why don't we go here and then one.
Why wouldn't you use, you know, private pension plans, defined benefits, were, until ERISA of 74, I think it was, you know, they weren't, there were several funded, but most were unfunded, okay? So why wouldn't you just take on that and basically on the unfunded liability, amortize that over 20 years like they did in ERISA of 74, and then what you had to do each year, you were obligated to put away the service charge for that year, the service cost, and then each company was allowed to make an assumption about the liability and asset stream, and usually if there was between, well, if the asset to liability stream was 1.5% assumption difference, that was fine, okay? It was conservative. If it was 3 or greater, it was aggressive, okay? And that's how you kind of, but why wouldn't you just do something like that on the existing?
You're way over my head. I'm gonna put that right there.
But I mean,
I think, but see again, as we move forward, you need to be at the table making those type of recommendations, and we need to vet it. That's
I would just say that I think, you know, I think if I were representing a pension plan, I would say we do amortize that over a couple of decades. I mean, that's how, so let's just say you had a fully funded plan right now, and markets tanked for some reason, you had a loss, or you didn't hit your target, I'll just put it that way. You're gonna have an unfunded liability, and usually that is taken and basically spread out over up to a 30-year period. Some places we've seen up to 40, which is really crazy. So basically they are. The difference with the public plans and the private plans is you have ERISA that's governing the private plans. So basically the kind of stuff that's happening in the public sector and the $1 trillion plus of unfunded liabilities, part of the reason that's there is because there is no oversight coming from anyone else. The federal government, decades ago, not long after I was born, decided to pass ERISA because they saw problems materializing in defined benefit private sector plans. They basically slapped some standards over top of them and a lot of restrictions on how they operate and even a lot of constraints about how much they can assume about the future. They are much more conservative after ERISA. Now I know people have different opinions on that. None of that's happening in the public sector. The public sector plans are basically unregulated and they're up to the policymakers to decide how are we going to run this. And so that already is creating a problem because you have a lot of electeds who just don't know this issue and don't understand it. They are deferential to the plans themselves, and that's how you then fast forward and get into a big mess. So it's having legislators take that responsibility is what needs to happen.
A couple things. The insurance fund for that has gone bankrupt a long time ago, and Congress has had to fund more money into it, which goes to the point that you really can't figure out this else. But let me just tell you, there is probably not a single public pension plan that would be legal under the ERISA regulations.
Let me give this side of the room one last opportunity to ask any burning question you might have. Anybody on this side? Yes, sir.
I apologize for these gentlemen.
They
have identified the issue is who's sitting at the table and who put that person there to do the oversight. Because I've sat on fiduciaries. I've been a mayor of a city where I took them out of Social Security because we could get a better retirement. Then Social Security, and then Congress had to join Social Security, so we had to go back. But the issue is, what do you plan in this next legislature to come up with a ERISA concept or better oversight of getting people appointed like what Dallas just did by taking out some of the politics and putting good measures like a 2/3 vote? What do y'all have planned to pass for these public plans to get better management in place? Because I've sat on some, they didn't even know what a prospectus was.
Number one, if you're a legislator, you have to worry about getting reelected, whether you're worried about it or not. And then number two, I think that it's like the senator said, we're going to put it all on the table. There's too many things that have gone wrong, and as I said earlier, the template for pensions is throw it out the window because it didn't work. We've reached a point where you can blame it on people living longer, you can blame it on markets going south, you can blame it on people taking too much out of it. I mean, you know, we had proposals to be able to retire at 48 years old. Heck of a deal. I would already be retired. But anyway, yeah, just for a couple of years. But anyway, I mean, you know, all of those things that they started out were well-intentioned, but everybody lives longer. Markets are not they're more volatile than they've ever been. And I think that we will be looking at it. There's no question you have to change things.
And
the private sector is doing it.
And same thing, Senator, I believe Lieutenant Governor Patrick asked that we look at these pension systems, and I'm pretty certain that Joan Huffman, who's led the charge on the state systems, has been charged with that responsibility.
Folks, what an absolutely fantastic panel. Please help me thank them.